Next up, let's build our website header. And the website header will just be something very simple. So we're just going to put the logo here on the left side and some simple navigation here on the right side. So just like I showed you in the sketch that I showed in the beginning of building this hero section. Now this content, so the logo and the navigation, I actually don't want them to be in a fixed width container like this one here. So this one here, this hero section, is exactly 1300 pixels wide, right? But again, now the navigation and the logo, I actually want them outside of a fixed width container like that, because that is something that I personally like a lot. And also I have seen that on many websites. And so yeah, I like that. And I thought we could implement that here just to practice a little bit more and not always do everything in the same way, right? So let's go to our markup and add the header right here before this section. So I'm actually going to use now the header element, and I will still give it a class name and call it header. And again, that is because I want to have it as a rule to only select based on class names. Okay, with the exception of sometimes then selecting elements inside of classes. But still, the beginning is always with class selectors. Okay, so remember that the HTML5 element header is basically to be used at the beginning of a website or also of some specific content, like in a section or in an article. And we did actually just that in our very first project, where we used the header element at the beginning of the website and then also at the beginning of the article. Remember that? So here then let's use an image for the logo with the class of, well, simply logo. Then we also need the alt text. And here we just say it's the 𝗦𝗞𝗘 logo. And then the source of image. And then here it's actually this one, 𝗦𝗞𝗘 logo.png. So that is one part. And then we also want the navigation. And for that, remember, we use the nav element. And the nav element is yet another semantic HTML5 element, which should be used for major navigation blocks that we have on our page. So not all collections of links need to be wrapped in a nav element, but here, semantically, we do want to have the major navigation of our page. And so it makes sense to then use exactly this element with that meaning for it. Let's just give it a class. Let's call it main nav, because in the footer we will have another navigation, and then we're going to need another nav element there. And here for now I will just write some text. Okay. And then let's actually wrap the rest of the content here inside of the main element. And once again, the main element is a new HTML5 element. And what it means is basically that it contains the main content or the main area of a certain web page. So of a certain web document like this HTML5 page. And once again, the main element is a new HTML5 element, so a semantic element. And what it means is that it contains basically the main part or the main area of a web document. Now, what it does not include is content that is repeated across multiple pages. And so that would be the case of a header. So basically this part here, if we had multiple pages, we could use the exact same header on all of the pages. And so that means that it's not part of the main part of any web page. And the same thing for the overall page footer. So that one should also always be outside of the main. But in here we can just put it inside the main element. And so we make it a little bit more semantic. So we don't even need to give it any class, because we're not interested in styling it. This is just to let, for example, screen readers and search engines know that, well, this is exactly as I said before, the main part of our page. Okay, so let's check it out. And the logo is huge, of course. So as always, we need to start by fixing the images here. Okay, and before we do any of that, it's actually time to now format this file here a little bit. So what I will do is to put like general and repeatable components at the beginning, and then create some division for each of the sections. Okay, so we can add some stars here to create some nice division. And then let's say general components, and then here copy that. Then here we have the hero section. Then we have the header. Okay. So the heading primary is actually used just once, but still I will put it here in the general components. So that's also why we gave it this kind of reusable name here, right? Let's actually write it here as well, reusable. And again, that's why it does have this kind of generic name there. The same for the buttons. They are not just to be used here, but everywhere throughout the entire page. So let's grab them, put them here. Nice. Then here is everything about the hero, but then again, this one is one of the repeatable ones, because this is the helper class that we created and which might be used everywhere. Okay, and this one is actually everything about the hero. And so now here, let's go to the header and format the logo a little bit. And usually I like to style the height of images, which is a bit easier to control, I think. So height, let's go here to our spacing rules. And for example, let's try 24 pixels. So 2.4 rem. Okay, so that looks quite good. And so now let's work on the layout a little bit and also on the visual styles. So as I mentioned before, we want each of them pushed to one of the sides. This one on the left side, this one on the right side. And actually we already did that before, so this shouldn't be too hard. So we can simply use Flexbox here, of course, where the header must be the flex container. And then remember, the trick to push each element to one of the sides is to use justify content space between. Now we should also vertically align them. Okay, that looks quite good already, but of course we need some spacing. And also we kind of want to make the header look as if it is part of this whole section here, right? And so we need to give it the exact same background color. So let's fix the background color here and the spacing. So background color is not so hard. It's just this one here. Actually, exactly this line of code. So no need to type it out all again. And now let's fix the spacing. And here, what I'm going to do is to actually give this header a fixed height. So using the height property and setting it, for example, again to 9.6 rem. Now, why am I doing that if usually we simply allow the content to define the height and then adding some padding usually? Well, the reason for that is because in this case, we actually want to make this navigation sticky a bit later. So sticky meaning that as we scroll down the page, it should stay at the same position. And for this to work, it's a bit easier when the height is actually fixed. Okay, so let me write that here. So because we want it to be sticky later. But of course, it would be just fine if you didn't have this condition here of making it sticky later to simply use padding. Okay, now we will still need padding, but only on the sides. So padding, and so on the top, we actually want 0 padding. So top and bottom, and then on the right, let's see what we have here. Let's use 48 pixels. So that will then basically be the space between the sides of the viewport, so the sides of the browser and this content here. So let's check that out. And yeah, this looks quite beautiful. I just think that maybe the logo here is a bit too large. And also the spacing here now is way too big. So we have a lot of spacing here between now this header basically and, well, this section here. Let me show you. That's because here we have this huge padding of 96 pixels on the top, right? Then we also have 96 pixels here of the height, which then makes the whole thing like really big. So let's decrease the padding at the top here and also decrease the logo a little bit. So starting with that, and here we should probably not go to our next value. So 16 would be way too low because we actually just want to reduce it a little bit. And so we can just break the rule here a little bit, basically. So maybe like this. And then let's reduce the padding at the top here to half. So we're going to do 4.8 rem. Then on the side 0, bottom 9.6, and on the other side 0 as well. Yeah, that looks better. And this will look even better once we have the actual navigation here, which is what we're going to do in the next lecture. Okay, so for now, everything looks perfect. Let me just reduce here the viewport so we can see that. So you see that always, of course, we keep this space here, right? And let's see here also our header. And of course, some things here are not perfect yet, but we will fix that later using media queries. So remember, that is the technique that we use in order to adjust our layout and our visual styles for different viewport width, right? However, there is something that we can already fix at this point, which is the fact that this content is now completely glued basically here to the side, and the same here. And so that should not happen, because imagine that the user has exactly this screen width right here. So this doesn't look so nice. And so let's add basically some padding here to this hero element. So yeah, that's right here. So we have, of course, some margin to center it horizontally. And so let's add, as I just said, some padding here. And so we will then see in the inspector exactly how this works. So maybe 48 pixels is a bit too much here. Let's go one step down, which is 3.2 rem. Okay. And so this, yeah, this is what I mean. Right, so now this space stays here, this 3.2 padding, because the element still goes all the way here to the end, of course, which is what I wanted to show you. So the hero still goes, as I said, from left to right, but then we have these green bars, which is the padding, and only inside of that padding, then we have the content, right? So we also have that margin here, and of course the padding here on section hero. And probably we could have just added this padding also to the section hero, but well, I think it is a bit more natural and easier to understand like this. Okay, and with this, I think we're actually ready to tackle the navigation here in the next lecture. In this video, we're going to build the navigation for our web page. And we're going to do that right here inside of this nav element. Now, in our very first project, way back at the beginning of the course, we simply put a bunch of links, so a bunch of anchor elements right into this nav. However, that is not the most semantic way of building a navigation, because a navigation should basically be a list of links grouped together. And so, what we should do really is to create an unordered list. And then inside of that list is where we're going to add our links, so the anchor elements. So we're going to use the UL element, and let's call it the main nav list. Okay, and so this is basically how everyone does their navigations. So they have a nav element, then a UL element, then in there a bunch of LI elements, and for each of them, or better, inside of each of them, we will have an anchor element. So for now, these hrefs are going to point nowhere. And also, we don't know yet where we want each of these links to point to. So later, we will want these links to lead to a different section of the page. And also, we don't know yet where we want each of these links to go to. I mean, later on, we want each of these links to lead to a different section once the user clicks them, but we don't know yet what sections those are. So I'm just going to write section 1 here for now. Okay, not giving them any class just yet. I will do that a bit later once we actually need them. So let's just do 5 of them, and then we will see as we go what is actually the correct number of links that we want. Okay, just checking it out, but of course it will not be as we want it. So we need to get rid of the bullet points, and we want them to be side by side. So that is the main nav list. So let's add here another block for the navigation, because here we will actually need a lot of code. So list style should be none. And also we want the elements to be side by side. Display flex, right? So as always, or at least as many times, we reach one more times for flexbox here. Okay, and let's also add some gap here. Let's say 3.2 rem for now, just to have something to work with. And now it's time to actually style the links themselves. So not really the LI elements, so there's not really a need to style those, because we already created the space between them using the gap property here on the flex container. So without flexbox, we would now need some space between the link elements, and then we would use margin on each of them. But again, now we don't need that. And so I'm just going to style the anchors themselves. So main nav link, and let's add that to all of them. Okay, also copying the class name. And here again, styling both link and the visited pseudo classes for now. So as always, removing the text decoration. I'm also going to want to give them this darker color here. Let's make them a bit bold, but only like 500, not super bold, because that then gives them too much focus. And also let's use again the font size of not 20 pixels, because that is reserved for the paragraph, but one step down at 1.8 rem, or 1.8, right? So again, this one here is at 20 rem, or at 20 pixels, and this one is at 1.8, and so is this one. Okay, now let's change their color here once we hover them. So we could use some other gray color, maybe a lighter gray, or even a darker one. But what I want actually is this orange color. And I'm going to use exactly the same one as this one because of the color contrast issue. So not this primary color, but actually this a bit darker one. Okay. And also, of course, we want that to happen with a transition. And so let's actually already add that here. So remember, we use the transition property in order to create animations between different values for a certain property. And here I will now start using just all, and then again 0.3 second. And so this will then animate all the values for all properties. And again, this one we need to put basically on the original state, which is just link, right? Let's grab this here so that we can work on the hover and active states. And here, as I said, I want to use this darker version. Okay. Yep, this looks quite nice. But now there's something that I want to do, which is also quite common in website navigations like this, which is to actually have a call to action as the very last item in the navigation. So basically, we will want to have something like a button here, which is similar to this one, and which is probably going to lead to the same place on our website. So basically repeating the same call to action here and here. So that is something quite common, as I said before. And so let's do that. So basically we need to style this last one here a bit differently. And so let me add another class here. Okay. Now we could have selected this one, of course, using the last child pseudo class, but I actually need to style this here in many different places. And so, I mean, multiple times here in the CSS. And so that would be a bit cumbersome doing it like that. So I'm just going to leave it like this. And so what I want to do now is to add new styles to just this element. And in particular, I want it to look similar to the button. Okay, so basically this one here. So maybe not the font weight, not the font size, but the border radius and the padding. Probably even the padding should be smaller, but let's see. So where's that? And as always, we also need the link and visited pseudo classes right here. Okay. Now here we also want the text color to be white. And in order for this padding here to apply, it should be an inline block. And actually, let's add that to all of them. So right here. So for links, that's just a good practice because many times we're adding some padding there. And so usually I have the habit of always setting these links in a navigation to an inline block. Okay, let's check that out. And as you see, the background color is not applying. And so this is something that we observed before actually already. So let me inspect this here and show you. So we should have somewhere the style with the different background color. Well, actually it's not here. So yeah, actually I didn't even write the code. So that's why it doesn't have the different background color. So background color, and it's this one. So let's see now. And actually that does work quite nice. Just the padding is way too big here. And also we now have to vertically align all of these items here because, well, this is of course not what we like to see. So that's right here in the main nav list, which is the flex container. So as you already know, here we just use align item center. And then let's dramatically reduce the padding here. Let's say, so again, usually you have this system here somewhere where you don't have to scroll up and down all the time. But anyway, I'm going to use 24 and then half, so 12. So 1.2 and 2.4. Okay. And now just to make sure that this always applies, I'm going to use that end selector that I showed you before at some point. So basically we want this here to apply when both the nav CTA class is there and the main nav link as well. So we can copy this one here and paste it here like this. And so without any space, because like this, it would be the descendant selector. But like this, it means that it has to have both the main nav link class and the nav CTA class. Okay. And then once we do this, this so-called specificity, as you see here, is now 3. And this other style here is just 020. And so now we can make sure that this here will always apply. Okay. Now let's finally just add the hover states here as well. Hover and active. And so here we simply want to make the background color darker, just like in our main call to action button. Okay. And here we do not have to add the transition here because it is already right here in this main nav link, which of course is also applying to this link right here, right? So of course, all of this is now applying to the nav CTA because, well, it also has that class right here. So this code is applying and also this one here. Okay, so we have just one conflict, which is with the color. And so that is the one that is being resolved now because here we have these 3 as the specificity and here we have 2. Okay, so again, that's the reason why we added this part here to this selector. Okay, and yeah, there we go. Working perfectly, all of them. And so, yeah, great. Now this text here, of course, is not ideal, but we are just building the site here. And so we will change this later as we go. Okay, so this looks perfect. I'm just going back here because we already have some more design values that I want to update. So here we have this border radius, which again, I'm using pixels here and not rem because this is something that I do not want to scale up or down. So it's just this really small value and I want to always keep that. Anyway, here we have border radius. And so let's put here that we use by default 9 pixels. Shadows we don't have yet. We also have some more font weights. So we actually now have also 500, 600, and even 700. So this one I'm calling it bold. This one medium and semi bold. Okay, I think we also have some 1.05 and we have some 1.6, I believe. So I'm keeping track of that. Yeah, so 1.05 And there is that paragraph for the description. Yeah, here. So here we used 1.6. And so I'm keeping track of that up here in this comment here, so that later as our file and as our CSS code grows, we don't end up using different values here and make the design inconsistent. Actually, let me call this one here like paragraph default or something. And then this one is the default. Yeah, this one I'm just calling it small. Okay, so this is not really that important, the names. But yeah, just keeping track of these different design decisions that we have been taking. Yeah, just to ensure a consistent design across the entire page. Okay, and with that, we kind of finished this entire part here. I think it looks beautiful, and I hope you think the same and that you're having a lot of fun up until this point in this project. And of course, it will keep being amazing. And so let's now move on to the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to use CSS Grid in order to set up a grid that we're going to be able to reuse over and over again on our page. And let's start by adding some HTML here. So I will actually add now the next section that we're going to build, which is the How It Works section. So here we have the section hero, and then after that, but of course still in the main part of the page, we're going to have another section which is called section how, so which stands for how it works, basically. Okay, and now here I will simply add a couple of div elements just so I can show you the reusable grid that we're going to create in this lecture. So test one, let's just copy this, or actually let me show you an even better trick than copying it, which is using this command right here in the selection menu, and then copy a line down. So this is something that I use all the time, and so I even created a special shortcut for it. But for you, the shortcut should probably be similar to this one here. So that is Alt or Option, and then Shift, and the arrow up key. But for copying down, it is Option or Alt, Shift, arrow down. So watch what happens when I click here. So basically it will simply duplicate this line. And so I do this a couple more times. And this is, again, something that I do all the time when working in VS Code. Okay, now let's just quickly style those. So something just temporary, which we will delete a bit later. And actually let's style the section how as well. So instead of just doing that later, I'm going to do that immediately here. And so that I will do down here, because of course we're going to need some additional code for this section. So I'm also copying here this comment so that we can create a nice additional code block here. So the How It Works section. And then here, let's add a padding. And I will do the same padding that I also used on the hero section. So 96 pixels on top and bottom, and then 0 on the sides. And for now, let's just give this some background color, actually. Let's say orange, red. Okay, and now just giving those four also some background color, just so we see them. So I can say here first, or actually the nth child, and then the first one, background color, let's go with this one here. And now I will again use that shortcut to duplicate the line. So that is Shift, Option, and arrow key down. So number 2, 3, and 4. Here let's use blue. violet and maybe some yellow color. Okay, just quickly checking it out. Oh, somehow that didn't work. Oh, and indeed, here we only have one section how. So of course I want to select the nth child of the div elements that are in there. So let's add that in all of these. Oh, that didn't work somehow. Ah, now that's better. Let me just give them some padding here. And this is temporary, so we can just use pixels. And also the font size of even something like 50 pixels. Okay. But now let's say that we wanted to arrange these four here in a 2x2 grid, for example. So how would we do that? Well, we could of course go back here to our section how and then set up that grid, right? However, we would then write that code maybe multiple times over and over again in different parts of our website. And so that's something that we want to avoid. And so instead, I will actually create a reusable grid. Okay, so that's the whole point of this lecture. And well, let's do it right here for now. So I will simply create a new class here, which I'm going to call grid. And then, of course, I will make it a grid container. And let's also add some gap here. Maybe, again, 9.6 RAM. And here, it needs actually to be RAM as well, of course, not pixel. And I said that I wanted a 2x2 grid. So that means 2 columns. So grid, template, columns. And so let's actually use the repeat function and then saying that we want 1fr twice. So remember that this is the exact same thing as writing 1fr, 1fr, right? Okay, and so this now we can add here, right? And so now the section how is also a grid, and so this code also applies now to this element. And so if we give this a save, then we should have our grid, and indeed, here it is, right? Okay, but this is actually not really reusable yet, because let's say that we have another section then. Let me just copy it here, why not? So now we have it twice here, and indeed, it's exactly the same thing. But let's say that this one here, I actually wanted it to have 3 columns. So what would we do then? So we cannot change this one because the first grid here, we still want it to be 2x2. Only this one here should have 3 columns, right? And so the way to make this really reusable is to basically export that style from the grid and create yet another class that we can then add here and here. So let me show that to you in practice. So grid. And then here I like, again, to use these 2 dashes to say that this is a variation of the original. So grid, 2 calls, which stands for 2 columns. And so here we will now add this code. Okay, and then we can copy it and say grid 3 columns. And then here we of course want to repeat this 3 times. So, can you see what we're going to do now? Well, now we just have to add grid 2 calls here to this class list. And then here, grid 3 calls. And so with this, we're going to achieve exactly what we wanted. Right? So our first grid is a 2x2, so with 2 columns. And the second one has 3 columns. Right? And so now our grid element here is way more versatile all over our page. So we can use it in different situations and then simply use this other a variation class here basically to create a grid with 2 or 3 columns, or we might even need 4 columns. And so that is very easy as well. So let's say here we wanted actually 4. And so here we go. So now it is 4 columns. And we can, of course, also see that nicely in the dev tools, where we see, of course, or actually here, the parent, of course. So here we have the grid code applying. So the code from the grid class. So this one here. And then we have the grid for calls, of course. So this one here, which then makes it so that we have the 4 columns as we specified here. Right? And so this is a very nice technique to basically export these different styles into different classes in order to make them reusable across our page. Now, another thing that we might want to reuse a couple of times over our page is a centered container element, right? So that's something that we have used a couple of times in past projects and actually already also in our hero section, right? And so let's actually also export that into its own class like this. So a generic container, basically. Let me do that here. And a bit later, I will then, of course, move all of this code here to the generic section in our CSS file here. But now let's create a container here. And so this container is going to be the element that we're always going to use in order to center the content on our page. So inside of the browser viewport, right? So as always, we need to define a width here. And we do that again using the max width property to make it nice and fluid. And here I'm going to go with 120 rem. So that's basically 1200 pixels. And that's kind of a standard, we might say. So that's something that many pages use. Another one is 1140 pixels. So this is somehow also some kind of convention that you can also use. And that's actually very similar to this 1200 pixels, which I really like to use. So basically with this here, we are now defining that most of the content on our page, which will live inside our container of this, will have this width here or less. So when the viewport is less than 1200 pixels, then of course the container will shrink down, right? Then we can center it also using margin set to 0 and auto. And remember that this auto here, basically what it does is to give the same margin to the left and right side, and it will be figured out automatically. And so since these two margin values are the same on both sides, it basically makes the content look as if it was centered, right? Now, okay, and now we can apply this once again, for example, here. Let's add it first, but the order doesn't matter, of course. So now this element here is going to be a container and a grid with 2 columns all at the same time. All right, and here you see it. And let's shrink it down. So all the way to 1200 pixels. And then, of course, it is shrinking down. Now here we still have those, because they come from down here, from these, which are a bit too big to fit this viewport. But here, actually, it is happening what should be happening. So everything is nicely shrinking, right? Now here we just have that problem that the content is all the way glued here to the left and the right side. And so we should probably add some padding to our container element here, just like we did actually right here in the hero, right? So there we added 3.2 pixels, or rem actually. So here, and so let's do the exact same thing here. Okay. So yeah, right here. And by doing this, we will basically subtract 32 pixels from both sides of our content. And so in the end, we will actually end up with something very similar of these 1140 pixels of width for the content. So that's because of the box model. So let me show you what I mean here. So So this is what I said. So we defined this box to be 1200 pixels wide, but then, as I just mentioned, we basically subtract 32 pixels on both sides, and then we end up with these 1136, which is almost those 1140 pixels. Okay, and so now when we do this, then the content is no longer glued to the sides. Okay, however, usually when we have a background color on the section, we do want the background color to extend all the way to the sides, right? So exactly what we had also up here, right? And when I say background color, then the same might also be true for some kind of background image, right? And so what we need to do is to actually not add all of this here to this element, so to the section itself, but instead wrap all of this into yet another div element. And so this is the one with all these classes, right? So this one here is actually the container, the grid, and the grid with 2 columns. Well, now something is strange here. So let's inspect this. Oh, of course, it's because these selectors that we did here with the nth child are no longer working as expected. Because now this one here is actually the first child of this section, right? So this one here is now applying to the entire box. But, well, that's not really a problem anyway. So let's just remove those styles, since we do no longer need them actually anyway. So we can maybe just leave this here. And so now we want the div that is a child of the div of the section how. So that will then select these 4 here. We just give them some other random background color. Well, maybe not orange. Yeah, just like this. Okay, and so now we can nicely see how the background color extends all the way from the right to the left side here, all while keeping this in a nice container that keeps being centered, right? And then again, once the viewport shrinks, we then get this nice space right here. Okay, so that works beautifully. This one we no longer need. And, well, let's just keep them here for now, but we don't need them anymore as well. So deleting this style. And so these reusable classes, I will now put them up here. So in the reusables, and right at the very top, because we're going to use these ones all the time as we build the rest of the page. Okay, now just one more thing, which is that you might be wondering why we did not use this sort of container in our hero section. Because we actually did something a bit similar. So we have the section here, and then in there we have a container, which is a grid with 2 columns. So in this case, that is called hero, but it is very similar if we take a look at it. So yeah, right here. It has the margin, it has also the padding, and we also declare it as a grid with 2 columns, right? However, the big difference here is that the hero has a larger width. So the container that we defined has 120 rem, so 1200 pixels, and this one has 130 rem, so 1300 pixels, which means that it is 100 pixels wider. And of course, it wouldn't have to be like this. So we could have done the exact same width, but actually I like it visually better when the hero section is a little bit wider than the rest of the content. So let's check that out. And now it's not really so visible anymore because we took away the background colors, but you can still see that the container now starts here, but the hero section starts a little bit more here on the left, right? And so again, that's because this section is wider, right? So if it had the same width, And we can simply do that here. Then, of course, it would be nicely aligned with this one, right? So now this container starts here, as we can see by hovering over it, right? And then the other container now starts at the exact same thing. And again, that's because it has the same width. All right. But then this hero image here shrinks a little bit because as it has less space, of course, it needs to become smaller. And so I personally like it when this is bigger. Also here we now moved to 4 lines for this content, which of course we could fix by make the text smaller. But yeah, I think that especially on bigger screens, it looks better when this, when this hero section is a little bit bigger. So I can just increase this, and then you can see that this image here gets a lot bigger, and we get more space here as this increases. So 130, and yeah, I think that looks better. But of course, if later you build your own layouts and your own hero sections, and you have a different type of content, maybe you're building one of the headers that we built in the previous section, which simply had a background image and then some content, then of course it might be perfectly fine to simply have the same width on the entire page. And then you could reuse that container element also for this situation here. Okay, so I hope that made sense. And it is the reason why basically we built a special section, so a special container here just for this section alone. So the hero is many times a little bit different and a bit special, and so it's not a big deal to here not have the reusable code. But then from now on, we will use this grid that we just set up in all the sections that follow. Okay, so I hope that made sense to you and that you understand the logic behind basically dividing the functionality into these different classes. So container, grid, and this one here, and that you can incorporate this technique into your own coding in the future. And now what we're going to do next is to start building this how it works section. So stay tuned for that one. Let's now start building the how it works section. And so here we are going to build something similar to what I drawed in this sketch here. So yet another one of these beautiful sketches here that I have. And you see that we have something like a Z pattern here. So similar to that example that is here on the bottom right. Now here, each of the rows of this Z pattern will be for one of the steps of how 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗓 works. Okay, so with those big numbers, a bit similar to that very first design that I have here at the very top. So we're going to have those big numbers, then something like a smaller heading, and then some description of the step itself. And then on the side of that, there's going to be one of the 3 application screens that we got from 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗓. And above all that, I also want to add a headline, something like this other small design example that I have here. So where we have this big headline, which is a bit informative about what this section is all about. And then above that, in this small and colored text, there is a very direct description of the section. So basically naming the section. And so as I mentioned before, this is a very nice pattern that I have been seeing. And so I would like to use that now right here. Okay, so I hope this looks like fun. And so let's now get started with this. And actually in the last lecture, we already created the section here. And of course, also these container and grid classes. But let's remove all of this and start over with a blank section. And so now let's add our first container element here for the section heading. So I'm going to give it the class of container, because of course we're going to want to have these headings centered on the page. And here it's now time to use the h2 element. So after the h1 that we had here, so right here, This is the primary heading with the H1. And so remember, there should only be one H1 per page. And so now in each of the sections, we're going to use the H2. And again, I'm giving each of the headings a class name so that I can select everything using classes. And so this is a heading secondary. Okay. And I think here we actually do have the heading. So that's this one, your daily dose of health in 3 simple steps. So this is quite a descriptive heading of this section. But remember that now, before that, we also want to add basically the name of the section to make it a little bit easier for the eye to scan quickly the page in case we don't have the time to read this big heading here. Then we can simply read how it works, and then immediately it becomes clear what this section is all about. Now here you might think that we could use like an H3 element, for example, because this one is simply smaller than the H2, and so H3 might look like a good choice. But actually it is not a good choice, because if this was an H3 here, this would actually not be a heading of any new part inside of this section. So basically this H3, the goal of it is to describe what this H2 is all about. So basically naming it in a way, right? And so I believe that here using a heading like this, so an element which has the semantic meaning of a heading, is not the right choice. So we can of course use H3 in this section here, but it should then actually describe some new part of the section. Okay, and we will in fact use an H3 in a minute, and then it will make a bit more sense. So here we should just use something generic like a paragraph or maybe even a span. So remember, span is like a generic text element, and so let's use that here. And let's call it a subheading. So not heating. That's right. And so here we write how it works. Okay. All right. And now let's actually add our Z pattern. So basically all those elements which have the text and the images. So basically the content that we want for this section. Now where should we put all that? Should we put it also inside of this container right here? Well, not really, right? Because for the layout of that component, so of that Z pattern, we will probably need our grid, right? And so we do not want that grid here. Here we only want these headings. And so we can simply create a new div element and also call it a container. That is no problem at all. Okay. Now we could also, of course, have created simply a new div in here, like this, and then call that one a grid. So that would have worked as well, but I think it's cleaner to just keep adding new containers like this. Then these pieces are a bit more self-contained, right? So we have just one container for the headings, and then we can actually nicely copy that here from one section to the next one without worrying what comes next. All right, so then here we have our container, and this is probably where the grid will be. But for now, let's not worry about the visual part here and only about the content. So if you remember the sketch that I showed you in the beginning of this lecture, you will remember that there was like a box on the left side with some text content, and then on the right side, the image, right? And so let's now create boxes for those two. So let's call this a step text box. And then the other one will be a text box for the image. Let's actually put that right here immediately. So step image box. And since we're here, and since this one is very easy, let's immediately put the image right here. And so it is inside the app folder. And then, of course, we're starting with the app screen number 1. Then let's give it a class of step image, which is why the parent element is called the step image box. And so then, of course, we need the alt text. Never forget that. And here, this is actually on an iPhone. So I'm calling it iPhone app preferences selection screen. Giving it a save. That's not correct. And let's just quickly take a look at the image just so the description makes more sense. And so, yeah, this is like a screen where the user can select their preferences. And so that's why that's the description that I gave it here. Okay. And now here, as for the text content, remember we want the number of the step. Then we want like a heading, a smaller one, and then some text description after that. So let's use a P here for each of them. So here, let's call it the step number. And it starts with 0, 1, of course. And now it's actually time for that H3 that I mentioned before. And first of all, let's get our content here. So we have these 3 blocks, and this one is the first one. Let's get that. And let's just paste that in here for now. Okay. So we have all of this here, and it's kind of separated here with this colon. So this here is probably the right text for the heading, and this then for kind of the description of this step. Okay. Well, actually, it shouldn't be here. It doesn't make any sense. It should be here indeed. And now I'm just cutting this part here, and I'm going to put it inside an H3. And again, I'm assuming that this one here might be reused across the page. And so I'm giving it a more general name. And I'm not going to call it like step heading or something. Okay? So I'm calling it heading tertiary now, because it might be reused somewhere else. And so on headings, that happens all the time. And therefore, they are a nice candidate of giving them like a general name like this. Okay. And now let's just add a paragraph again for the description of the step here. So step description. Okay. Just removing these colons here. And there we go. So as I was saying before, now here it actually makes sense to use an H3 because this kind of introduces a new part inside of this section, which is this piece of content that comes after it. So here it does make sense to use an H3, while here it really didn't make a lot of sense. So that's why we went with this generic span here. Okay, now let's just take a quick look here and, well, there we go. So the image, as always, is very large, and they are, of course, not side by side yet. But, of course, we want them side by side. And so let's now use our grid class. So let's go up here. And so the container, we already have it right here. And then let's add the grid. And just like this, we easily transformed this into a grid container, which has this gap here. So all without writing any new additional CSS. And then, of course, this one is the one with 2 columns. Okay. Now this gap here is just temporary. It might not be the one that we use in the end. So we're probably going to change that later. And here, quickly getting rid of this background color. Okay. Nice. And now this image, as always, is way too big. So let's make it flexible by saying that it should occupy only basically 100% of the available parent. So images are always one of the first things that we have to style because, as I mentioned, they do not automatically scale up or down like text. So let's just say with 100%, or let's even go for 50% for now, because 100% also seems kind of large. And so with this we are safe, at least for now. So we're just experimenting here anyway for now. And so yeah, that looks better. Can of course inspect this very quickly. And indeed, now each of the two columns are the same size, as we can see here. And yeah, the image occupies exactly half, so 50% of the parent container, which of course is this step image box here. Okay, but for now, let's not worry too much about the visual style, and instead, let's keep adding our next step here. Okay. Now, before going back, remember that now we want it the opposite way. So here we have the text on the left side, the image on the right. But since we're building a Z pattern, which remember is quite popular on startup sites like this one, then we will now have the image on the left side and the text on the right. And so what that means is that the next element in the grid will be, again, an image, right? So it's the opposite now. So yeah, here we had first the step text box and then the step image box, but now we will have the step image box first. And here I forgot to close this. Now that's better, but still Google Chrome managed to fix the code, because you see that actually it looked the same before, so it looked correct before. And so that's because browsers are actually very forgiving with our errors in the HTML. They will still try to understand it and then fix these errors internally. But anyway, let's now go to step 2, and let me actually add some comments here. So right in the HTML, and remember, we can hit Command/ for that, or Control/ on Windows. So here that's step 01, just so we don't get confused as the code gets longer and longer. So step 2, and eventually we're gonna have a step 3. And why not copy this here immediately? So 2 and 3. But of course, we now need different descriptions. So now we need to describe this one here. So it's still an iPhone app. Let's call it the meal approving plan, because, well, that's what this one here is all about, basically. So there's one of these meals here per day, and then the user can approve it or not. And then the app screen number 3 is basically for the delivery, right? So let's call that iPhone app delivery screen, and here screen as well. Okay, and now let's get the step text box here. But remember that here in step number 2, it should appear after the image, so that it's on the right side then, while here in step number 3, we are building the Z pattern, and so it is now back to the beginning. Okay, and now just replacing the content here, 02, triple clicking here and putting it here. And this of course belongs again in the H3. And then finally, step number 3. So creating the HTML is always some copy pasting. That's just completely normal. So just as I'm doing here. Okay, here we need to use step 03, but now we should be good. And indeed, we now have a nice Z pattern. So beautiful, well, except for, of course, the text formatting and the size of these images. But the content itself is already arranged in the right way. So the layout is already working thanks to our reusable grid. And yeah, so now let's take care, I would say, of styling first this heading and this subheading right here. So that's the heading tertiary. Oh, actually not, it's the heading secondary and the subheading. And so these are going to be reusable. So let's put them up here. So close to the other heading. And well, since we're building another heading here, we can use some of the same design elements as here. So we might use the same color, the same font weight, and maybe also the same letter spacing here in the heading secondary. And so we should probably not just copy them here, right? That would not make a lot of sense. So instead, we can create a list of selectors for the heading primary and the heading secondary, and then simply add the styles that are common to them right here. So moving down so that we can select all three of them at the same time and then move them all up here. And so now immediately with this, the heading secondary also has this color, this font weight, and also the decreased letter spacing. Now, of course, the font size should be smaller. So let's go maybe one step down from 52 to 44. So that's exactly why we have this system. Otherwise, now we would have to think about this font size. So should we use 40 pixels or 45 or 35? But no, we don't have to think. We just choose this value and then we just check out if it looks nice or not. And let's actually do that right now. And yeah, I think that is not too big. The color is also good. We just didn't define any line height because it is just one line, at least in this width. Because imagine that the page gets small. Well, then the line height is not so well defined. So let's give it some line height here. And since the text is still quite large, let's go with 1.2 here. And that didn't look as if it changed a lot, but yeah, still that looks good. So let's keep it this way. And yeah, about the color here, I just chose it at the beginning of this section here. It seemed kind of randomly, right? Just this 333. So I told you back then that I simply like to use these gray colors, which all have the same number. So we used 333 for basically the darker text, and then 555 for the lighter text. But of course, we could also have, for example, used a shadow or actually a shade. So for example, instead of using like 333, we could have used this value here. So just to illustrate that, let me actually do that here. So I'm just declaring it after this one, so it will then override it. So no need to replace that one. And so you see that this still looks quite decent. Maybe it's a bit too dark. Let's go with this one. And I'm not going to keep this anyway, but just to show you that this actually does look quite good as well. And it nicely integrates actually with the rest of the colors, like with this orange color. And that makes sense because, well, that was actually the starting point of creating this color in the first place. Now, the reason why I'm not using this color here for our design and a similar one for the rest of the text is because that will kind of move us away a little bit from the typical look of the startup website personality, which uses more of the gray color than really these like earthy looking colors. So colors like brown and things like that. So here we are going more for a little bit more traditional gray, I would say. And so that's why I simply went with a regular gray instead of using a shade. Also, instead of using a shade, we could of course also use the color from open color here. For example, this one here. So this is actually quite similar to 333. And so, yeah, why not try that out as well? I will actually keep this here just as a comment, like as a reference that you could have used that one. Okay. And so this looks decent as well. However, these gray colors here, they have a little bit of a blue touch. So if you look closely, they are gray, but they are pushed a little bit into the blue direction. So I think that doesn't really fit our background color here, and of course our primary color as well. And so that's the reason why I went against that. So just trying to give you some more insights into the design choices here. Right. And so again, for a startup personality, I think one of these neutral grays that is really a true gray works just fine. Okay. But anyway, now about the subheading. First of all, let's actually make it a block, because remember that we used a span. And a span is an inline element, and so we need to make it a block before doing anything else. Then let's give it a font size, and let's just start at 20 pixels. We can always tone it down a little bit then. And the font weight, of course, needs to be a bit smaller now. So not 700, maybe 500. So slightly above the regular. So medium, I think I called that. And now here, remember, we want our primary color. So that's, it's already here. So that's this one. But actually, we should not use this one, because remember that there is some issues with using these colors on, and let me show it to you. So remember using this orange color on this background color right here. So the color contrast ratio was not perfect for that. And so I will actually use this orange color for the subheadings as well. Now in this case, of course, it is on the regular white background, so it might be okay, but probably at some later point, it will not. And so let's give it, again, this darker orange color. And just by the way, I'm noticing here that the text is way too big. So let's put it a little bit down. So maybe 1.6. And here I'm going for that darker tone now. Okay. Let's now also make it uppercase. So text transform uppercase, and also some margin to the bottom of 1.6 rem. And by the way, maybe you've been noticing something that I have been doing for some time actually, which is to write these property names here in VS Code simply like this. So without any hyphen, for example, and simply keep writing. And so that works because VS Code will still recognize what I want when I then use the autocomplete with enter like this, right? And I can even like do it just with the first few words, and then I can start writing the BO for bottom, and then still VS Code will recognize it. And I also do it for stuff like background color. So I can immediately start writing the color, and then immediately it will give me the property that I'm looking for. Right? So that's just another nice trick of VS Code. And yeah, here we're just missing some big spacing below this heading. And also we can give this one here an additional touch by adding some space between the letters. So when the text is really small in uppercase, it looks nicer, like it gives it some space to breathe if we add some letter spacing there. So I believe that will look really nice. So letter spacing like 0.75 pixels. And of course, you can experiment around with this as you like. And actually, this is already the second time we have used some letter spacing. So let's add that here to our design decisions, basically. So we have used this one and also minus 0.5 pixels before. And we have also already used a 1.2 at some point. So let's call this medium, for example. The name doesn't really matter. It's just so we keep on keeping track, basically, of our design decisions. Okay, now just here, let's add some big space to the bottom here. So again, using that trick of simply starting to write the second part of the property name. And here again, let's actually go for 9.6 RAM. Okay, you might think that this maybe looks a bit too much because that is also the padding of the section itself, but it will not be. Let me explain you why. And so the reason is because, as I said, we have 9.6 RAM, so 96 pixels here, so between the beginning of the section and the beginning of the content, but we also have 96 pixels here. So this one is also plus another 96 pixels. And so here we have like 192 pixels, I think, between all of this. And so having then 92 pixels here should be then good again. So basically to have this part here, so this heading, stand out nicely from the content that comes next. And that will of course be way better visible once we actually style all of this here. But let's leave that to the next lecture actually. So hopefully I see you there soon. All right, let's now keep on working on our how it works section. And we're gonna start with these three text elements right here. All right, so that is the step number and the heading here and the step description. So let's go down here. And starting with this one. So if you remember the design example that we started with here, remember that this text was really large. So let's select a huge font size here. So like 86 or 98. So I'm gonna start with 98 here, maybe even. So 9.8 RAM. Let's also make it quite bold. But since the text is so huge, let's not go with 700, but with 600 maybe. And now the color. And here again, just like the design example I showed you, we want a very light color. So a very light gray. And so let's again go with that approach of using gray colors that are like this. So with these three values here all the same, instead of using some other gray color from some other color system. Okay? And let me show you how I come up with a color like this. So here we want it very light. And so we know that the lightest one is basically white. So that's FFF, right? And going down from FFF a little bit darker is then EEE. Okay? The next one would be CCC, BBB, AAA, and then 99, and then 8765, all the way to 0, which is complete black, right? So let's just try this, even though it's probably going to be way too light. And indeed, it is a little bit too light here. Right, probably even a bit too big, maybe. So let's make it a bit darker and take it down one step here. So that's putting it at 8.6 RAM. And then here the next one is DDD. Let's try that. And that does look better, I think. So of course, in terms of accessibility, the contrast ratio here is very, very low. And so it will not pass that. However, as hopefully you heard at some point, rules are meant to be broken, right? So in this case, we're giving priority here really to the visual style, which is in fact not very, very important. I mean, the content here of 0, 1 is not crucial for the user to understand this design. And so many designers use some situations in which they do break these rules. So we didn't break it, for example, here. So I was very careful making the text here accessible and here as well, because this piece of content I think is actually quite important and I want everyone to understand it. But while here I think we can break that rule. And of course, this is all a bit subjective and you might not want to break any rules at all. And so then you would have to go with a lot of a darker color here. But then it doesn't look visually so nice. So that's why I went with this one here, because I really liked that design example that I saw and that I showed you, right? Okay, so we just need some spacing here probably, and then let's start working on this tertiary heading. So margin to the bottom, let's say 12, because there was already some spacing there, which always comes from the line height. And when the text is so big, then there's already a lot of basically default spacing after the text. So that looks good. And now we have the heading tertiary. And so this file is growing a lot, actually, and I'm a bit tired of having to scroll up and down here. And so what I will do now, and what I many times do, is to split it up into 2 files. So that is, of course, perfectly fine. It's something that we didn't do yet, but it's no problem to split our own CSS code into 1 or multiple files. So here inside of the CSS folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it the general.css. Okay, and so I will put all of this general code here, the one that we reuse all the time, and that includes this design information here. So I will put all that here in general. Okay, and then the rest simply stays in the style file. Then of course we also need to include that here, right? Otherwise nothing works. So here we want a style sheet again. And now or general. Oh, and of course I need to close that. And now it's fixed. And let's see if it looks the same. And it does. So we're still good here. Spacing also looks okay. And so let's now style that tertiary heading that we just added here. And once again, let's go with the same font weight, color, and letter spacing. And so I'm also adding that to the list here. And then let's give it another font size. So 1 step down maybe. So from 4.4, let's go to 36 or maybe 30. So we'll see that in a minute, what works best. So 3.6 rem. And let's also give it that line height of 1.2. And let's immediately add some margin to the bottom here of 3.2 rem. And of course, in the real world, you would have to experiment around with this a lot, but here we cannot take that much time. And so I will just use these values here as I think they make more sense and not always scroll up and down here in our file. Well, let's actually first style the paragraph as well, so that we can see if the visual hierarchy that we're building here makes sense. So this one is now again specific to this section, and so it goes into the style.css file. So let's start with maybe 2 rem, but that's maybe a bit too much. And then I will also used the same line height of 1.8. So what I have here is basically the same text as we have in the paragraph, right in the hero. Or actually here we have 1.6 somehow. And still the font size of 2. But let's try 1.8. And, well, the text is way too large, actually. So let's tone that down. And also the image. Like, it occupies almost the entire viewport here, right? So let's take it all down a notch here, and the image as well. So it's now 50, let's make it like 30%. And here, going down to 1.8 rem. And also this one going down to 3.0. So let's check that out. And that does look a bit better, right? Also the spacing of 1.8 looks good. I think 1.6 would be a little bit too little. And now just this image here is a little bit too small, I would say. Also, we want it to be centered. So let's actually do that first. So basically, let me inspect this here. So inside of this step image box, we want the image to be centered vertically and horizontally. Well, right now, vertically it's not necessary because the content is large enough, or actually it's not large enough. So if this was a big text here, let me just, so we can actually do that here in the inspector. So I'm just copy and pasting this a couple of times here just to show you. And so now, of course, we would need to center it both vertically and horizontally, right? And so let's start by doing that now. And so this image is right now inside of this step image box, right? We haven't selected that yet. So let's put that here before this image. And so, to easily center the image inside that, we simply use Flexbox. So just as we have been doing all along, we use Align Items Center and Justify Content Center as well. Nice. And so now it is, well, yeah, I think it is centered both horizontally and vertically. Yeah, as you see. So this is without the vertical centering, and then the image would actually stretch from top to bottom. And do you remember why that is? Well, it's because on Flex items, by default, they are set to align items stretch, right? So if we turned that off completely, then of course it would be no longer stretched. So then of course it would not be vertically nor horizontally aligned. But like this, it is correct. It is still a bit too small, I think. Let's actually reload so that the text goes back to normal. Okay. And let's increase this a little bit here, just so we can see it. So 35, which is like a middle ground between 30 and 40. And 40 looks way too much. I think that's the one we tried before. So 30 was too little, so let's keep it here at 35. Okay. Now, I think there's still too much space here between this image and this text. So let's inspect this here. And the reason is that this grid here has a huge gap. So it has, I believe, 9.6 rem vertically and horizontally. And horizontally, I think it makes sense because we have been using this 9.6 here all the time. So it's also the margin here between this heading and the start of this content. And it's also what we have here at the beginning and the end of each section, right? So for the row, again, I think it makes sense, but not for the column. That's just a bit too much. Especially imagine if we had 4 columns side by side, then this huge gap would take away a lot of the space. So let's fix the image here, set it to 35% of width, and then let's fix this gap here and make it a lot smaller. So 35, and then our grid is of course in the general CSS. So we want this to be the row gap, so keeping that for the row, but then for the column gap, let's set it to 6.4, which I think is 2 steps down from what we had before. Okay. And, well, that didn't change a whole lot, it looks like. At least I don't remember what it looked like before. Well, we can try putting it back here. And yeah, I think some text here now shifted down, actually. But anyway, yeah, this will be important also later on for the other sections when we have more than just 2 columns. All right. Now here, actually, the content is smaller than this one here. So basically here in step 2, this has this size, but here we finish here like too soon. And I think the same will happen here, right? And so what this means is that we want to vertically align this element right here. So how can we do that? Well, there are multiple ways. So the first one would to also make this element here a flex container, just like we did here to vertically align the images, right? So vertically and horizontally aligned in the case of the images, but here we just want it vertically. So again, we could use a flex container, but here we actually have multiple elements, and we would then have to change the flex direction so that they are back to being like vertically stacked like we want them to be. And then we would have to justify content, center them. So that seems like a bit too much work here in this case. So the next option would be to select the step text box here. And then, since they are grid items, we could set align self to center, I think. And so let's actually do that. So this is the one that we will choose, but there would be another one. So we could also simply set on the entire grid container here the align items property to center as well. So this is what I mean. Let me show it to you here in the inspector. So align items set to center. And so, as I just said, that would then immediately fix that, right? If you look at that one here, it is now vertically centered, and the same down here, right? So we could do this, or again, we could also select all of these elements here. So like this one here, and then align them individually to the center by using align self. So you can do whichever you prefer, but well, I thought I would do this one, but actually I prefer to set it on the parent element. So setting align items to center on the grid itself. So let's do that. So back here on the grid, but where do you think I should put that? I should not just put it here, right? So align items set to center. So that would work. So even after reloading here, now everything is nicely and vertically centered, right? But this is not the way to go, because again, this grid is supposed to be reusable, right? And we might not want this setting in future grids. So for example, in the next section, we will create some cards, and then on the side of that, we will have that list of diets. Remember that? And so those, we will not want them vertically aligned in the center. Therefore, then we could not use this grid, which of course we want to use. So the solution to do that is to basically create yet another class which will act like basically yet another grid setting. So these can be seen as grid settings as well. so adding some stuff to the grid. And so we can do the same for things like this alignment. So I'm calling it grid and then center vertically. And so I just take that from here, paste it here, and then we can simply add this class to this grid. Okay. And if this seems too confusing for you, of course, all of this would not be strictly necessary. So you could just create one grid for each of the grids that you want on your page. So without having these reusable grids, right? That would be perfectly possible. But for a scalable page and to make our code a bit cleaner, I'm showing you this technique because I think it is a lot more valuable. Okay, but anyway, now you see that it still works. And so seeing again in the inspector on our grid, so the parent grid container, now we have all these settings here. So we have it display as a grid, we have all these gaps, then we have it with these two columns, and we have align items to center. Okay, and with this, we could now actually say that we finished this section, right? So it looks quite nice, but I still have this issue that there is way too much spacing here. So right here. And if you ask me, it doesn't look so interesting visually as well. So again, we could just declare this design as finished, but instead, what I'm gonna do is to add like a circle here to the background, so behind basically this screen here. And this will make more sense once I actually show it to you. And I think the circle will look quite nice because there are actually quite some circles already. So here in this design itself, there are circles here anywhere. And also in the logo type, we have actually these two circles. So the circle is kind of like a brand element itself, if you want. We have some circles here as well. And so I think this might look quite nice. So adding a circle basically means to add a new element. And so let's do that. But we do not want to do that in the HTML, right? So we do not want to come here and inside of the hero image box add like some new div and then call it circle. So we do not want to pollute our HTML with those visual things. And so instead, we're going to once again use a pseudo element. Remember that? Well, a pseudo element like after or before basically insert a child element into the parent. So in this case, this hero image box, and we can then use that element as if it was in the HTML. So even though it is not really. Okay. Now this pseudo element needs to be added to this div element here. So this one here, because we cannot add it to images. Okay. So the before and after pseudo elements cannot be added to images because, well, in the HTML themselves, we are not allowed to add child elements to images, right? So we will simply add it here. So let's use the before one. And remember, to make it actually appear on the page, we need to give it some content. And it doesn't matter what, it can even be empty, but it needs to have some. Then usually we can set this to a block element, especially if we simply want to make it into a shape, which is basically what we want to do. Now let's give it some width here as well, because just as the image, we also want this one here to be flexible. So that's why we are going to use percentages here as well. So let's go with 60%, since the image is 35. And so this is significantly more than that. And then let's set the height also to 60%. And this is just to show you that actually it will not work as expected. But still, I'm going to do it. Okay, because this is actually important to understand. Okay, now let's just give it some background color. And I will use this very light one. So the lightest, basically white, or, well, yellow that we have on the page. Okay, so this will not look really good yet, but let's just see what we have. Well, actually, it's not really there at all. So let's inspect what's going on here. Ah, here it is. So it does have some width, but apparently no height. Right, so let's give it some height manually here, like 100 pixels. And now you see it. Right, so if we cannot use 60% here in order to make it basically a square, and we need it to be a square so that we can then make it a circle, we need to find another way of defining the height. And so let me show you a nice hack that we can use. So this is like a trick that goes around this thing of this not working. So let me comment this out. And now let me show you that trick. So what we can do basically to give it the same height of 60% is to add a padding to the bottom. So padding bottom, and now here we can define it as 60%. And this works because even the padding to the bottom is actually defined on the width of the element. Okay, so again, these 60% here are actually 60% of the parent element's width. All right, so basically exactly like this. And this is very important to understand. So let me show it. So let me actually write that here. 60% of parent's width. And that, again, is true even when we add that to the bottom here. And so this will now basically create an element with an intrinsic height of 0, but then with a padding of 60%, which will then make it square. Right? So again, the height is basically 0, but then since we're adding all that padding here to the bottom, it will appear as if it was a square. Right? And so that is a very nice trick. Great. So we're going to make it a square. So it's here now and it's here and on all of them. But as you see, it is now kind of pushing this one here to the side because of course it needs to occupy this space here. Right? Now in order to basically take it out of the flow here and also to position it nicely like behind this image, we can simply position it absolutely. And so let's do that. And so this technique is basically exactly the same that we used before, for example, in our very first project to mark, I think, a blog post as a top post, right? I think that's what we did back then. And yeah, so this is the exact same technique. So position absolute. And remember that in order for this to work, we need to actually make the parent element in relation to which we want this one to be positioned. We need to make it position relative. Right? So we can start here with top 50% and left 50%, because remember, we want it centered, right? But you know already that this is not going to work, right? So it puts it here, where basically this corner is now at the very center, right? And so remember that technique that I showed you in the last section, which is to use the transform property with the function of translate. So translate will basically shift the element, in this case 50% of its same width and of its own height. So 50% and actually minus, and then also minus 50% to pull it back up exactly by half of its own height. Okay, so let's check that out. And indeed, there it is. So it is nicely centered, and this time not using flexbox, but instead using absolute positioning. And we didn't use flexbox here, well, because we basically want this element here to occupy the exact same space as the image, right? And so here, flexbox was not the right way to go, while with the image, it was. Okay, now let's just make it round. but of course you're still wondering why is that square actually on top of the image. And so let's fix that as a next step. For now, let's actually put that below here, just so we keep the context of this comment here. Right, so now it's nicely this circle, but now we basically need to put it behind this image. So this one here has been positioned on top of the image, and that is not what we want. But fortunately for us, using CSS, we can fix that, because there is this very handy property called z-index. Now, z-index can be a little bit tricky to work with, because there are many particularities to it, and the way it works is quite confusing, actually. But when it does work, then basically elements that have a higher value of z-index will appear first. So will appear on top, right? So what we're going to do here is to simply reduce the value here. So instead of adding a positive value to the image, we will simply add a negative value here. And so that will then basically push it back in the order. So for example, we can use -1, and so now it's fixed. So now it's basically below the image. Now another way would have been to put the positive z-index here, but that might not work for some reason. Let's just say 10, for example. And so actually this also worked in this case, but I'm still doing it like this as we did before for something that I will explain next. Okay, so this looks quite nice already, but we can still do better, which is to add another circle here. So this is just one circle. It looks a little bit boring. So it has the same background color as this one and still not really interesting. And so I will add another a bit smaller circle right here like this. Okay, so this is something that, again, I saw somewhere on some other site when I was looking for inspiration. And so basically I'm stealing like an artist here once again. Okay, so I didn't come up with this on my own once more. I just saw this in some other website, which I do not remember, unfortunately, so I cannot show it to you. Okay, so what we're going to do is to add another pseudo element, but we cannot use before again. So we can only use before once, but fortunately for us, there is also after, which basically does the exact same thing. So we can just do step image box and then after. Now many of the things here will be exactly the same, except here for the width and the background color. And so let's basically export all of this here into, again, a list of these two, and then have the styles that are unique simply in each of these CSS rules. So before and after will be, well, I'm just going to cut everything except this. Okay, so both of them will have this, and actually the z-index also must be unique, as we will see in a minute. Okay, and now let's make this here slightly smaller, as I was saying. So a width, let's say 50% here, and then using that trick that we used before, making that one also 50%, and then the background color. And here I want it to be slightly darker. So let's go here to our tint generator. And so this is the one we have been using, and I'm now simply going to go with the next one. So copying it, and I'm also putting it right here into the general file immediately. So now we have multiple. Let's put this here down. Okay, and you can see here also that it is a little bit darker. but it does make a lot of difference when used in background colors. Okay, let's see. So this should already be on the page now. And yeah, there we go. I think it's a bit too big, and it is also on top of the image once again. So let's make it smaller, as I was saying, 45 maybe. And then the z-index, let's also put it to -1. And this one we actually want to be at the top of this one. So the smaller one on top of the bigger one. So let's make this one -2. And yeah, there we go. This is the effect I was looking for. And just by adding this small thing here on the side makes it look a lot more interesting and a lot nicer, I think. Yeah, I think this actually finishes this part. So this section, let's check it out from the beginning. But I think everything is nice and beautiful. So I had a lot of fun designing this section, and the result, I think, is really, really nice. So hopefully you think the same, and you still learned a lot of stuff here along the way. So you learned how to use the after and before pseudo elements to create a nice design like this. You also learned about the z-index property, which is quite important. And as I mentioned, it's not always super easy to use, and usually you will have to experiment a lot in order to make it work the way you intend. Then we also went back to using again this technique here. So this centering technique using absolute positioning and then top, left, and transform. So this is a really important one, and that's why I mentioned before that you really should make sure that you know it before moving on. So it was great that we had another opportunity to practice here. Now, okay, and with this we finished the section and are now hopefully ready to go straight to the next one. Welcome back, and let's keep working on our beautiful 𝗠𝗞𝗞𝗘 project. And if you remember correctly, we actually did skip one section, which is the featured in section. So I first wanted to show you some stuff in the how it works section, and so that's why we skipped the featured in one. But now let's go back a step and work on that one. And so here, what I want to do is basically exactly what is here in this design example. So just without the text that is there in the bottom, because we don't have that. But still, what I want to do is to have these logos there, all basically with the same height, and then some featured in text on top of all that. So that shouldn't be all too hard, right? And so let's get started. So let's add that right here before, well, actually after the section hero. So here between the hero and the how it works section, we will add the section that I'm going to call section featured. Okay. And once again, we're going to want this content to be centered in the viewport. And so for that, we have our a nice container already created. So remember that this container gives our element basically a fixed width of 1200 pixels. It also gives it that nice padding at both sides and makes it also centered in the viewport. Okay, and so now let's fill it in with first the heading and then also the 5 logos there side by side. Now for the heading here, I will actually use again an H2 element. So H2, and you might be surprised by that because this H2 element will look completely different than all the secondary headings that we have on the rest of the page. Because here we don't want a huge title, but instead, just like in that example that I just showed you, we just want like this very small gray text, just basically introducing this section and saying that, well, basically 𝗠𝗞𝗞𝗘 has been featured in these 5 publications. Right. So again, you might be surprised why I'm using the H2 here, But the reason is very simple, because this is yet another section, and this heading is the main heading of that section. And so it should be a secondary heading. So we have an H1 in the very beginning, and then in each section we want an H2. So even if it looks very different from the secondary heading, the meaning should still be the same. Okay? So of course I will not call it here a heading secondary, so I'm not going to reuse that style. So instead I'm going to call it heading featured in. Okay? So as featured in. Okay, then here I'm adding like a container element for the 5 logos. And I'm gonna call it logos. And then here finally we have the 5 logo images. So that's again in IMG. And then here is in logos. And then let me start with TechCrunch here. So TechCrunch logo for the alt text. Okay, and now I will again use that shortcut of Option or Alt Shift down just to copy it 5 times. So next, let's use a Business Insider. Then the New York Times. So I actually experimented here around a little bit before to find what looks best here. So the best combination or the best order of these icons or these logos. Now that doesn't really matter here, but well, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. And finally, the USA Today. Okay, and if we take a look now, then that will look pretty terrible. Yep, just like expected, because these logos are all huge and they have all these different colors. But never mind, we can style all of that easily as always. And let's start at the top. So with the featured in heading. And doing that, of course, before the how it works section here. Let me copy this one here again to also create a nice visual section here in our CSS file. Okay, the font size, let's make it quite small really, because we will actually make it uppercase. So just like the subheadings, like we had in the previous section, I also want to make this one uppercase, just to make it consistent with that. And also for consistency, I will add the same letter spacing of 0.75 pixel. Remember that. And also the font weight of 500. So I think that's also what we have in the subheading. Let's just check that out. And indeed, here it is. We're just making this one even a bit smaller. Okay, let's see. Okay, that's already looking good. Let's just center it. And then we will also adjust the color a little bit. But let's do that actually after fixing the logos so that we can find a nice gray color that combines well with the logos. So text align center. And since we're here, let's give it some margin to the bottom of 24 pixels. Okay. And we should also add some padding to the entire section actually. So padding and top and bottom, and I will go a lot less than 4.8 rem or 4.6, which is what we usually had. So I will just use half here for now. So this is a very small section, and so we don't need all of that padding. Okay, so this looks quite okay, but of course, now let's make the icon smaller, or the logo smaller, and also put them side by side. So logos is the class name of the container, and once again, to put them side by side, I will make this a flex container. Okay. Now you might say here, these images are already inline or inline block elements, so they will automatically be side by side, won't they? And there you actually have a point, but if I don't use Flexbox, then it will be a little bit harder to space them. All right, and so even with images, I always like to use Flexbox. Okay, now here I'm going to use justify content, but let's actually do that later, because for now I want to make the logos themselves smaller. So notice how I didn't add a class to each of them. So I'm just selecting them here with the descendant selector. So let's give them a height of 32 pixels, which is one of our values. Or let's try 40 pixels for RAM. And yeah, for now that should be enough, just to see what happens. And that's way too big actually. Let's go one step down, actually to 3.2. Okay, and I'm using the height here to style them and not the width, because that looks a lot more natural. Well, there is still something wrong here. Let's see. So this is not even applying. Oh, it's called logos. So that is why. And that's better. So let's again try with 4, which is what I had before. But still, this is a bit too big. So let's leave it at 3.2 actually. Okay. And now here, as for the spacing, let's simply use Flexbox to automatically figure out the spacing for us. So justify content space between. Let's start with that one. And yeah, so here we go. So this looks already quite nice, doesn't it? However, actually, visually, I think that this content here, so these 5 logos, they should not be as wide as the rest of the content. So here they are perfectly aligned, and that is of course okay, but I want to show you another way. So here, instead of using space between, we can also use space around. So let me show you the difference. And so basically what it will do is that now half the space that is here between these two is now also here on the right side. And that becomes nicely visible like this. All right, so basically this space here is now both on the left and the right side. So it's here, and then imagine it's here. So it ends here, and then here starts another of those blocks, and yeah, all the way here to the end, where then again we have this small one. And I think that in this example, it actually looks a little bit nicer. So having it a bit more narrow. Then I think that the spacing here is a little bit too big. So let's fix that before we can then finally make these images here all like gray. Okay, so we don't want them colored like this, because this way they do take away a lot of the attention. And yeah, so we don't want that. So they should just take like a supporting role here on our page, but shouldn't be so attention grabbing. And also, it just makes the design look messy if there are so many colors around. So instead, we just want our design to be orange, then with all the variations of that orange, of course, but not with green and blue and another shade of blue and so on. Right? So, of course, we could go into some image manipulation program and make them all like gray. But that is not the point of this lecture, because we can actually do this in CSS with some tricks. So let me show you how, but first we're going to reduce that spacing there. So we have 4.8, which looks okay at the top, but at the bottom, let's take it down a notch, and then 0 at the other side. And now here, let's talk about making these images gray. So on images, we have a new property that we have never seen before, which is called filter. And with filter, you can do all kinds of stuff. So if you take a look at the list that VS Code suggests to you here, then the main one that might come here to your attention is grayscale. So let's try that. And then here we need to define a value between 0 and 1, or between 0% and 100%. And I prefer somehow to use percentages. And so let's do this, and let's see the result. Okay, so that is indeed a lot better already, right? But still the images are not like completely gray. So here, for example, this part here is a lot lighter than this one, which is like almost black. Then here, this is also quite black, and the text here as well. But again, we don't want that. We just want everything to be gray. So just exactly like in the example that I showed you in the beginning of this lecture, right? So I will show you how in a second, but let's also play around a little bit with these. So with these filters, because they are quite fun. So for example, we can blur images with different pixel values. And as we increase them, the images get more and more blurred. So that can be fun. Then we also have things like rotate. So that will then like completely change the colors. But maybe more useful, we can have like change the saturation. So we can hypersaturate images like this if we want, right? But the real one that we're looking for is actually, in this example, it's brightness. So the brightness, here it's now like at 50%, but if we change it all the way to 0, then you see the images turn completely black. So now it is not like before, where one half of the logo has one color and the other one has another color. And the same here. So now everything is black. And so this, for now, is perfect. So let's actually use that here. So brightness, 0. So this will make the image black, right? But we want it gray. So we can use the opacity property. And I'm not sure if we talked about this one before, but basically it does exactly what the name says. So like 100% is no opacity at all, which makes the image just completely visible. So again, nothing changes now because it is at 100. But if we take it down, and I will use now Shift down to go in bigger steps, then you see it becomes all the way to completely invisible, right? And so this is now the trick to make it basically gray instead of black. So if we use like an opacity of 50%, I think this is a very nice gray color for us, right? So of course we could have used, I mean, not we could have, but we could use this on any other element. So not just on images, but here it's just another image. So making it also 50%, well, I don't know, opaque maybe, but yeah, giving it an opacity of 50% makes it basically look fade out a little bit. So that's 50% here. And again, here we could also use 0.5 instead of 50%. That works exactly the same way. Okay, so that's beautiful. And now just this text, which is a bit too dark. So let's fix that. So right here. And again, I'm going to go with one of these, where all the three numbers are the same, and in this case 999. And we could experiment with different ones, but I think that this one is the best. Right? Yeah. So this color is now quite similar to these ones, while maybe a bit darker would be better, like 888. So again, going down is going in the direction of black, because black is 0, 0, 0. And so if we increase the values, the color becomes darker. And yeah, that looks perfect to me. And again, the color contrast here is probably not perfect, so I don't think that this will pass, but this is another one of those cases where it is not 100% important. Okay, it is actually quite close. So if the text was large or bold, then it would be okay. And yeah, well, we can actually say that the text is bold, but it is very small. So we can say that it doesn't really pass. And so this is one more time where I'm actively breaking the rule here. But as I mentioned before, I don't think it's a big deal here, because what matters are really the logos, right? And so now they are here, look very nicely, and still play just a supporting role. So without being too attention-grabbing, but still showing the user that 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 has been featured in these big publications like TechCrunch or the New York Times. And so immediately this company seems a lot more legit, right? Okay, but anyway, that's actually it for this small section. And so now let's move on to the next one, which is going to be after this one. So that will be our meal section. And that's yet another really exciting one, because we will design some very, very nice looking cards there. And so hopefully I see you there as soon as possible.